great turnout today. I'm so grateful that all of you chose to come out this morning and support this event. I'm Carrie Frank. I'm the Executive Director of Beloit 200, and I'd like to welcome you today. I'd also like to thank a lot of people that helped put this together. This took a lot of different people in our community, and I'm so grateful, first of all, to all of our educators that helped pull this off. We have people from every school district around our region here, and we're so appreciative that you were able to come this morning. I know that you have a lot of work going on. Also wanted to thank the library and the Civics Academy for hosting us and for helping with all the tech issues we've had this morning. Wyatt, you're amazing, even though something doesn't work every once in a while. That's life. So we won't judge him too hard. And then I'd like to thank Laura Grubb from Beloit College. She's been instrumental with Jeff Adams as well, helping pull this all together. And the chamber, Amy, and your team has been amazing, and the economic development, Drew, thank you so much for all your support. So thank you for coming out this morning. We have some really incredible speakers that I also want to thank you for investing your time and resources to come to Beloit, Wisconsin, and help us understand the changes that are coming today. So one of the things that City Center and Beloit 200 has been really passionate about is our education and making sure our students continue to be the best. You know, in Beloit, we do nothing but try to be the best, and so we also want to really invest in our children to continue to drive great outcomes, and that's what today is all about. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to come up and introduce our speakers and go from there. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Carrie. So my name is Laura Grubb. I'm the Nice Chair, or the Nice Professor of Economics at Beloit College. And I'm just thrilled to have these speakers with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing Alan Borsuk. So he is joining us remotely this morning, but we really appreciate it, Alan, that you're able to be with us. Alan has been a reporter and editor with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel for several decades. You may be familiar with some of his writing. Over that time, he's established an expertise certainly in K-12 education. And in addition to his role with the paper, he is currently a senior fellow in law and public policy at Marquette University. So we look forward to hearing more from Alan. And then I'm going to move over here. We have Colleston Morgan. So he is the executive director of the City Forward Collective, which is a nonprofit with a mission to secure Milwaukee's future by ensuring that every child has the opportunity to attend a high-quality school. In addition to his expertise in Milwaukee, Colleston has spent time in the New Orleans public school system. So his time there culminated in a cabinet role, so he was the district's chief strategy officer. Colleston is from Milwaukee. He earned his bachelor's in government from Harvard, and he has a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. And then next to Colleston here, we have Spencer Schien. So Spencer is also with the City Forward Collective. He's been there for just about a decade. 9 years. He is their their director of strategy and operations, but has really taken on this role of working with the data and understanding the data. And in the last several years has been working to understand in intimate detail the scorecard system in Wisconsin. He has a double major in political science and French from the University of Chicago, Urbana-Champaign. And then moving down the table, we of course have Nick Damasis, who is the director of the Beloit Public Library. He's going to be working as our moderator today. So as you think of questions that you would like to pose to our guests, please direct them to Nick, and he will make sure that they are answered. And then I think Carrie mentioned that Wyatt is here to help us with our tech. But again, I just want to echo Wyatt says no, I'm not going to be responsible. I want to echo what Carrie said, and thank you for taking the time to join us today, and look forward to the discussion.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Should I flip this over?
Just need some minutes.
Thank you.
And if you can just raise, yeah,
There we go.
You gotta talk right into it.
All right, hopefully everyone can hear me now. Good morning. Thanks again for having us. I'm excited to be here. Excited to have so many people here to talk about state assessment results. It's not usually the turnout you get for that. Give a moment here while we get this up and running. Awesome, thanks so much. I'll skip through the introduction so briefly and try to get into the meat of the conversation, but just grateful to be here. As was shared, I'm Colleston Morgan. I lead City Ford Collective. We're a Milwaukee-based organization focused on ensuring kids have access to high-quality schools of their choice. A lot of our work is statewide in reach because a lot of key decisions about education policy for Milwaukee, for Beloit, for our entire state require statewide influence. So I'm happy to share a bit today about the state assessment results. Each year, our team, Spencer leading that, prepares an analysis, so I want to give him credit in advance for all the good things and take blame in advance for any mistakes or errors that I might make in trying to translate our analysis and results. I want to start just by sort of level setting about how do we test and assess students in Wisconsin, which students are tested and what are the assessments. And I think it's helpful to start here before going into the results and what's changed. Federal law requires public schools across all 50 states, and here in Wisconsin, we require all publicly funded students.
We could hear Laura fine, but we're not.
Are you not hearing me?
Oh,
Is that better?
yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right, let's try that again.
Yeah.
So what I was saying is federal law requires public schools across all 50 states. And here in Wisconsin, we also require all publicly funded students, so students who attend private schools using any of our state's voucher programs, to participate in a series of annual state assessments. We call it the Wisconsin State Assessment System. In grades 3 through 8, those tests are called the Ford exam. They're administered in the spring. In grades 9 through 11, we use the pre-ACT series of tests, and then in grade 11, we require students to take the ACT with writing. Those exams cover English and math each year, and then science and social studies are covered only some of the years in those grade scales. So in addition to the state assessment system, of course, districts, schools of all types use other types of assessments for other purposes. But this is the one assessment that we know every child who is publicly funded, regardless of the type of school that they attend, takes each year. And so that's why we think these results are really important to look at. So each year, as I said, our team does an assessment of the assessments and tries to summarize some key findings. Usually this is a fairly straightforward process. It was a bit more complicated this year than most. I'll start by laying out our 4 big findings, and then I'll walk through in a little bit more detail what we found behind each of these. So first, just the top line results. We saw big gains in the number of students that earned ratings of what's now called meeting standards or advanced. However, important to say right next to that, those big gains are in substantial part because we saw a change to the test itself and a lowering of the standards or the cut scores that are used to determine whether or not a student was meeting those expectations. We try to look at this across some of our subgroups and how different types of students are performing. This year we found that those changes impacted different subgroups of students differently. And then finally, all of this assessment result rolls into something that's our state report card, which will come out this month. And that's how we understand the performance of schools and districts across the state. And we already know that because of all these changes to the assessment, there will be some changes to the report cards both this year and next year. So while there's a lot to go through here, there's still more to come over the next couple of weeks. So if I had sort of one overview on top of all this, I would say proceed with caution as we go through the results for the next few months here. First, let me start with the top line results. So in the chart that you're looking at here, the left column has last year's 2022-2023 results. The next column over has the most recently released results that were released a couple weeks ago. And then you can see the changes. Those changes are pretty dramatic. Double-digit percentage point growth. The most dramatic changes on our forward exam. In a moment I'll go into more detail here, but that test itself changed and the cut scores changed. But we also saw some significant changes on our ACT scores. The ACT, of course, is designed nationally, so the test itself didn't change, but the score required to earn a meeting expectation, or meets rating did change. The way that those score changes were distributed meant that students at the ends of the distribution, or the number of students at the ends of the distribution, grew a lot more, or changed a lot more than students in the middle. So our lowest category, what's now called developing, saw the largest loss of students, and our highest category, what was and still is called advanced, saw the largest gains in students. We saw smaller changes across the middle categories statewide. You might hear me saying categories instead of just saying students who are below basic or advanced, and the reason why is that in addition to the changes to the forward exam and to the cut scores for all tests, we also changed the labels that we use to describe the different categories of student performance. The topmost label was advanced, remains advanced, but the other three labels were changed. Our lowest performing students previously were identified as below basic. That grouping is now called developing. The next group of students were previously noted as basic. That's now called approaching. The third group of students, the first group of students is identified as having met standards, is now called meeting, was previously called proficient. And as I said, the advanced group remained the same. One of the many challenges that we faced this year is that in past years it was relatively more straightforward to understand what proficiency meant. There was both a national anchor, so the nation's report card for students in grades 3 through 8, and then the ACT College and Career Readiness benchmarks for students in high school grades. So when a student earned a proficient rating, we knew that they were proficient not just against Wisconsin state standards, they were also proficient against nationally normed benchmarks. Now, it's a bit hard to understand what is grade level, what is proficiency, what is meeting expectations. We've gotten a couple of different answers. So when asked directly, officials from the State Department of Public Instruction have said they think grade level is somewhere between approaching and meeting. When you look at the ACT benchmarks, which are the easiest ones for us to compare, it's clear that what ACT calls college and career ready now sits above our meeting, somewhere between meeting and advanced. We won't get the next set of neighbor nations report card results until next year, and then there's a benchmarking process that goes on with that. But we expect that when we get that, we'll find that the neighbor proficiency benchmark is similarly well above our new meets threshold. Why all the changes? In this state, decisions about cut scores and proficiency are largely delegated to the Department of Public Instruction, actually largely to the Office of the State Superintendent. And in this particular instance, we know that the state superintendent both requested or initiated a review of these standards and then ultimately had the ability to approve changes to those standards based on her request and then the department's subsequent work. As I said, those cut scores across all of the exams are lowered. The forward exam itself was also modified. They did bring in educators to help reset the standards in that forward exam process, but those educators were required to participate in the process that was closed door and with non-disclosure agreements, in part because they were looking at student data, but we don't really know what went on inside of that process. We just know the output. We also don't know whether or not that process is, the results of that process are the standards achieved through, or if there were subsequent changes made. One important decision that was made very early on in this process was to not have the current year's results be what we call backwards comparable. So they made a decision to say, we're going to reset the standards, and we're going to reset the standards without regard to what they were before. So the state has advised, and it's pretty clear now that we can see the assessment results, that the numbers we're looking at this year are not directly comparable to last year's results, which creates all sorts of challenges for organizations like ours, lots of others who want to understand how are students doing after the pandemic, how are students doing compared over time, how are we doing? We've had significant literacy reforms in Wisconsin over the last couple of years. It's going to be harder for us to understand, especially for our elementary, middle school students, what is the net result of those changes because of how this was implemented. I think it's worth just taking one last look at the NAEP in particular. So this is from 2022, which is the last time the NAEP exam or the Nations Report Card was administered. Lots of small boxes here. I won't try to have everyone look at them all, but if you focus on the red circle with the arrow on top, that's where Wisconsin was. Wisconsin was one of the most closely aligned states to the NAEP proficiency standard of any state in the country. It didn't mean that we were not at the top, but in the top 10 amongst other states. The far left outlier is Puerto Rico, and then the next lowest state over here is Virginia. Virginia went through a standard setting process or just completed one as well, but unlike us in Wisconsin, they raised their standards. They saw this chart and basically said, we don't have enough rigor in our assessments, we want to raise our standards. We expect that Wisconsin's circle will likely fall back towards the middle or just below the middle of the grouping of states next time around, which will be next year. And I've already mentioned the ACT benchmarks, which used to be somewhere between a 20 to a 22, and were reduced to a 19 in English and math and a 21 in science. So this ACT College and Career Readiness Benchmark is another one that's worth just spending a minute on. ACT does some pretty rigorous work nationally to set these college and career readiness benchmarks. They have access to universities for students who go on to post-secondary. They work closely to understand students who go into career pathways. What are the implications? So, they've got a pretty high degree of confidence that a student who meets their college and career readiness benchmarks is ready to engage in college-level work without the need for remediation. About a 70-75% chance of earning a B in an entry-level college course that's corresponding to that exam. So, by lowering our state standards from that ACT College and Career Readiness benchmark down to a 19, what we've done is created a situation now where we have a group of students, a couple thousand, who are identified as meeting standards, but not college ready or below college ready. And that has real implications for them. So for those students who choose to go on to college, thinking that they've met state standards, earning a 19 or a 20, they stand maybe a 50% chance or more in some cases of not earning a passing grade in an entry-level college course. That means that they're likely to be recommended for remediation. That means that they're less likely to complete a degree. We know that it comes with financial burdens. We know that it comes with all sorts of life-impacting outcomes over the long term. Or some of these students may choose not to go into college and may choose to enter into the workforce directly. We picked nursing as an example just because we could find the numbers fairly quickly here, but you can find examples of this across a variety of career fields. The difference in the average annual earnings between a career path for a student who earned a 19 on the ACT and a student who earned a 21 on the ACT, 22 on the ACT, ends up being about $45,000 a year in a nursing career pathway. It's the difference between having access to a pathway that might allow you to eventually become a nurse or a pathway that sort of keeps you in a nurse's aide type of role. All important jobs for sure, but certainly limiting in terms of life choices and economic opportunity. We know that these changes did not impact all students evenly. So we wanted to look at our different subgroups of students and understand how the changes impacted different demographics. So we looked at students who are identified with a disability or enrolled in special education. We looked at students who are low income, and we looked at our state's biggest racial and ethnic subgroups. And across each of these, we identified that students who are more vulnerable or what might be called historically marginalized or disadvantaged subgroups saw less gains, still gains, but less gains than their peers and not included in those groups. So for students who identify as low income, something on the order of 25% less of growth in their average scores. For students of color, 2 to 4 times less growth. And for students who are identified as special education students with identified disabilities, we saw 4 times smaller gains for those students compared to their peers who are not identified as special education students. So the way that these changes were implemented actually widened our state's already significant achievement or opportunity gaps. Finally, as if all that isn't enough, there's still more changes to come. So up until this point, we've only been talking about state assessments. The state assessments and a couple of other data points will be used over the next couple of weeks to release the state's report card for every public school, every private school that receives public funding, as well as every district in the state. And we already know that some board changes are coming to that state's report card. Again, let me start by backing up and talking I'll give the 2-minute version. Spencer has a much better, longer version of this presentation if you're interested afterwards. But at a high level, we have 4 components in our state report card. Achievement, which is basically a straight measure of how many students earn what's now meeting, what was before proficient on the state assessments. Growth, which takes a look at, from the start of the year to the end of the year, how much did the student learn compared to what we might expect them to learn. If the student learned more than we would expect, they get a higher growth score. If they learn less than we would expect, they get a lower growth score. The third component is what's called a target group score. This looks at the lowest performing students across the state and tries to say, are these lowest performing students who are enrolled in a given school or district learning at the same pace as their peers amongst all students? And then finally, the 4th component, which is on track to graduate, exactly what it says it is. It looks at attendance rates. If you have a 12th grade, it looks at your graduation rate. If you have some key grade levels, I think it's third grade reading, 8th grade math, it looks at those scores as well to identify whether or not students are on track. So those are the 4 pieces. One other important note here, in Wisconsin, not every school's report card is calculated the same way. The report card weights for the different factors, achievement and growth in particular, depend on the number of economically disadvantaged students or the percentage of economically disadvantaged students that you have in your school. So for instance, we do most of our work in Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, most all of our schools fall above the threshold where the number of low-income students that they serve is such that 5% of their overall score is based on their proficiency, the number of students who are on grade level. 45% of their overall score is based on growth. Some of our wealthier districts around the state, that ratio can be reversed. 5% based on growth, 45% based on proficiency, and it's sort of a sliding scale in the middle. So every report card identifies for this school or for this district, here's the percentage of economically disadvantaged students, and then here's how this weights out. So it's a little bit difficult to make statewide comparisons in this regard, but it's important to know. So as we look at this year's report card, here's the issue. We know that the achievement scores, which are again just based on sort of how many students earned weeks in advance in each school or district divided by the total number of students who tested, we know those scores are going to go up, and they're going to go up pretty dramatically because, as you saw, the percentage of students that earned meets ratings or above went up by double digits. The state acknowledges that, essentially, if they don't correct for this, we're going to end up in a place where every school is rated above, meeting or above expectations. Almost every school it earns a higher rating just because of the inflation in the achievement score. So they've kind of quick fixed it for this year. They're going to do some statistical work to try to keep the distribution as near as possible as they could to this year. They're also going to impose a floor, so if your score this year fell below last year's score, you're going to get the higher of the 2-year score. So it means that this year's report card isn't going to be comparable to last year's report card. And then we're going to do it all again next year, because this is kind of a 1-year fix that they're rushing through fairly quickly, but they've acknowledged that this isn't a sustainable approach. And so they've already told us that they plan to go through another process on this for next year. So caution with the assessments, more caution to come with the report cards, and still more changes down the line as we go into next year and sort of fully adjust into this new reality that we have of lowered standards and changed expectations. I'm going to pause here, put a couple of QR codes up for those of you who might want to go into more detail. Spencer's probably done a much better written analysis of everything I tried to walk through fairly quickly here. You can access that brief at the top link. And then I've also just shared a link to stay connected with us at City Forward Collective if you're interested in learning more about our work in general. But thank you all, and I look forward to your questions and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, great. We're going to, Wyatt's going to switch it over so that we're bringing in Alan through Zoom. And so I'm going to have the first, I'm going to ask Alan to respond to any observations that he may have as soon as we get him on here and see that he can nod that he is hearing me. Okay, he already nodded on the screen over there. All right, so Alan, we have some educators in this room. We have a lot of people that are really deeply interested in education for our community. You have said you're not an education expert, but you think very deeply on public policy and education issues, especially as a reporter background and that. What are your observations on Colleston's presentation and just the overall points made?
I don't know. Is he talking?
Yes.
All right.
Hold on just one second, Alan. We may have to do it. All right, go ahead.
Am I okay here now?
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm very impressed that this session is occurring, because it's a rarity. There's just not much interest in state test scores and in keeping a broader eye on how kids are doing. And this is very much at the heart of the issue. So I applaud the organizers and I applaud all of you for being there. Second, I really wish I were with you. I also really wish I hadn't tested positive for COVID 2 days ago. And it's still out there, and I'm feeling it. So this is a substitute, and it'll be much better if I were there. A few things I'd like to give us perspective here. Colleston didn't emphasize one point that concerns me, which is the change in the labeling of the categories in the state test. We lowered the bars. The DPI really doesn't like to use that term, but I don't know any other way to describe it. We made it easier to qualify as Colleston very clearly and laid out very well. But we also changed the terminology. I'm especially concerned that the bottom bracket, the lowest performing students, it used to be called below basic. And a lot of people didn't like that, especially educators. And it just sounded so negative and discouraging and so on was the thinking. On the other hand, it was fairly clear terminology. Now that bracket is called developing. And I don't know what the term developing means. I'm all in favor of kids developing in every category. My biggest problem is that there are a lot of kids in Milwaukee, in Beloit, and other, especially the urban centers in the state, who are really not engaged and on track in a very good way. They are not developing. And I think this change is a way of soft-pedaling that problem. I just looked up in Beloit under the new scores. 22% of the 3rd through 8th graders taking the forward test, 22.2, I think, were advanced or meeting, as it's now called, but 41% were developing. And in math, 46% were developing. So almost half of your students are in the, what we used to call the below basic category. In fact, it's probably higher than that if you use last year's terminology, because the bar was higher then. So I asked a couple of high-ranking people in the DPI a couple months ago when I first talked to them about this. I said, what about the kids who are not developing? I mean, they really, that's just not the right way to describe how they're doing. They're just not doing well. And they said, yeah, that's a good question. We have to do something about that. And my question is, what are we gonna do about it? I fear that we're actually backing away from concern about it. Now that said, we weren't doing so great before this change in focusing on how to improve the outcomes, especially for those kids in the lowest bracket, which, you know, this is their future. This is how they're learning and developing. What are we doing about it? You've got schools in Milwaukee, I suspect you do in Beloit, where there's 70, 80, and more % of kids who were in that below basic category. So that developing, I fear, is a way of backing away from focusing on what are we going to do as a state, as schools, as policymakers, as teachers, as parents, in every role. But what we're doing isn't good enough. I'd also like to add a little bit of historic perspective here, one advantage of being old. If you go back about 12 to 15 years ago, Wisconsin had what was regarded in many studies nationally some of the easiest standards for defining a student as proficient. And the gap between what it meant to be proficient under Wisconsin's testing system and what it meant under the National Assessment of Educational Progress, previously known as NAEP, was very substantial. And NAEP is a tough grader. It's hard to be regarded as advanced or proficient under NAEP. But there was a nationwide, it almost seemed like a consensus at that time, that we needed to have more rigor, we needed to have more consistency across the country. There was great variation in what it meant to be proficient from state to state. If you studied kid in Texas or Virginia or Idaho was proficient, it didn't mean the same thing as in Wisconsin or a lot of other states. Wisconsin decided to join in this movement of demanding more rigor and raising the bars. And actually, when I say Wisconsin, we've got this very unusual system. There's only something like 7 states in the country that don't have a state K-12 school board similar to the board or regions for the university system. Wisconsin is one of those. And Wisconsin is the only state in the country that doesn't have a state school board, but does have a chief state-elected education officer, namely the superintendent of public education. The result is that person has great power, because there's some degree on a lot of issues really doesn't answer to anybody else. So the change in Wisconsin to raise the standard to make what we call NAEP-ifying them, raising them to basically their NAEP level, much more rigorous, was the work of the state superintendent, who at that time was the person by the name of Tony Evers. Tony, and he had sole authority to do that. He also had the sole authority to enlist Wisconsin in what was popular then, pretty much faded now, I think, of the Common Core Standards movement. When we get to this point, and Wisconsin scores aren't looking so great, and there's been a lot of backing off from the national consensus on testing and standards and so on, we still have one person who can make the decision on that, state superintendent, currently a woman named Jill Undergate. So you ask who did this, it really does, the buck definitely stops at one desk, and it's hers. I say that not necessarily critically, I'm just describing the facts to you. So, Wisconsin is basically backpedaling to the levels, maybe not exactly the same levels, but in the direction where it was prior to 2000, I believe it was 12, when the standards were NAEP-ified. And we've softened them. well, okay, I hope this is helpful. A lot of educators would say it's more realistic, it's more encouraging for students. It plays to the popular notion of building a growth mindset in education for both students and parents and educators. But back to my main thought is, what does it mean as far as doing something to improve how kids are doing and their long-term outcome?
All right, thanks, Alan. The first two questions he's touched on. One is who is behind the changes, and then also what the intentions are. Because Colleston, in yours you use manipulation intended to reduce rigor, broke the Wisconsin alignment, and designed to not be comparable. Do you have, whereas Alan said, he was given some reason there of why and what the motivations are, and that it's good motivations, but then people can differ on whether that's good or not. Do you have, what are your thoughts on that?
Good questions both. I suspect that Alan and I probably are closer in agreement. So I should say, we are an organization that tries to start with facts and data. We do also take positions on issues, and we've been public in our concerns and expressing our concerns about these changes for the reasons that I shared in our presentation. I could go either way. I don't love the changes to the labels. They've offered an explanation around growth mindsets. I'm the parent of 2 school-age children. I didn't have discomfort explaining where my students were at in terms of being below basic. Neighboring states use, not meeting expectations. Other states around the country, I did some work in Louisiana that was mentioned. We used approaching in Louisiana. So different states use different labels here. It matters. The language we use matters, but I think what matters far more is the question that Alan was pointing us towards. What are we going to do about it? Whatever label we choose to categorize students by, or their performance on assessments by, we know that we have a large number of students walking in Beloit across our state that are not meeting the standards that have been set for them. So the labels are one thing, the standards I think are the much bigger issue. And to me, it's just indefensible to put a high school student in a position where they think that they've met state expectations, only to come to a decision to go on to college or a decision to go on into a career. There should be some truth in advertising here, right? A student who meets standards should be prepared to go on into the world of work or go on into the world of college and succeed, or at least have a fair shot at succeeding. And I don't think we're doing that, both in terms of the numbers of students that are sitting in some of our lowest categories across the state, but also through these changes that have now labeled a group of students ready by Wisconsin's newly adjusted standards, but not ready by what we know to be some of the best national benchmarks available.
And if I could just add one thing to that, it's hard to overstate the importance or how big of an impact it has just changing these standards in a way that's not backwards compatible. This is a time where school districts are recovering from COVID. Like Colleston said during his presentation, there are new reading initiatives that are being implemented across the state. But because of the way that these changes were implemented, we can't look at progress. Like, we are starting again now. And next year we'll have 2 years of data under these assessments, but like Colleston said, the report cards will change again next year. So realistically, we're looking at 3 years of not comparable data. And that is really a shame, and it makes things very difficult for people who are interested in seeing how schools are doing, how schools are progressing, like what schools they want to send their kids to. And so I just really want to emphasize that point.
Okay, great. Yes, and standards, certainly for standards, it's hard to, you want something you can measure. Expectations is another word that's often used, and maybe a community, an individual community changes its expectations, even though the standards may stay the same, so that longitudinal is certainly necessary. You mentioned, and then Alan, I'll come back to you on that too, is you mentioned an educational ecosystem. That was a phrase that you had on one of your slides. And then I think both of you have touched on the higher ed. So how do they feel about this? Are they part of that alignment? Are they glad that it's happening? Just give us, if you have a perspective on that sort of assembly line through higher ed.
I suspect there are others in this room who might be better able to speak to this than I am. You know, I know that even under our prior standards, you know, there was a challenge of students going into UW system schools or technical college systems, you know, going on to post-secondary institutions and showing up not prepared. And it looked different from different districts and different places. I know that some of the stories in Milwaukee and around, and for students from Milwaukee, more deeply, you know, but when more than half of students coming out of a district or a school in a district were in remedial classes when they showed up at a college, you know, that's noted, and I think that was something, you know, that's been a frustration and a challenge that our higher ed system has been working to figure out. Alan noted that, you know, we are unique among states in this elected state superintendent, no elected state governing board body. My sense, and I know a few states well, I wouldn't profess to be an expert on sort of full educational continuum, but like we have relatively low levels of linkages between our K-12 system and our post-secondary system. Other states, I think, do a better job of sort of connecting the data, connecting the dots, making sure that, you know, high school graduation standards line up with college entry standards, and, you know, so that it feels a bit more seamless. This feels like these sets of decisions have moved us further away from what I would say is that ideal, not in the direction of having a more aligned ecosystem of schools, especially on the K-12 to post-secondary pathway.
So Alan, you live in academia. What are you seeing as you're seeing these kinds of changes, and so for students getting into higher ed, and especially growing our own in Wisconsin?
I don't really live in academia. I do work for Marquette Law School, but I'm a total imposter. So I'm just beat up over newspapers. Maybe because I'm on powerful drugs for COVID at the moment. A little maybe looser tongue than I might be. I'm not, I agree with what Colleston said. I'm not very optimistic or keen on how the higher ed sector in the state is doing in terms of advocating for and partnering with K-12 sectors in building, let's call it a pipeline, to get kids into school. The percentage of kids, as Colleston said, who come out of especially high needs districts, low income districts, who need remedial courses or who are not going to school at all, is really very high, and that's really startling that they're getting out of high school not ready for post-high school. And I don't think the teacher pipeline is very strong. This is not the fault by any means only of the higher ed system. I think the political system has a big role to play in this, the general public sentiment. How much do we prioritize teachers and supporting them and building a quality teaching workforce? It's a really, really concerning subject. I'm not very impressed with the higher ed sector in Wisconsin and how it's doing in terms of being an ally to K-12 education.
Okay, thanks. We're going to start to take some questions from the audience. And what's going to happen here, one, you have to use a mic. It's the only way Alan can hear. It's the only way when we record we got it. And there are individuals that need this technology to be able to hear. So wait until you get the mic in your hand. And for Colleston to answer, I have to run back over and give him the mic. So.
I've got a number of questions that come up. One is, as you look at, I know you talked about the data, looking at the report card, but you seem to say that, of course, that automatically that achievement is gonna look higher on the report card. But have you actually looked at student achievement or test data rather than the report card? Because it's the test data that will give you the true look at what is the achievement of the students in the school districts. The second question is, Did you look at data as it related to bilingual or English language learners in the state? Because it's very clear in Rock County that there's a direct correlation between the percentage of students who are dual language and achievement scores. The more students with, more districts with higher levels of bilingual students is lower achievement scores. A comment, you had mentioned special education are not meeting the growth rate. Well, they're in special education because there is a reason why they are having difficulty learning. I'm not saying that we shouldn't expect very high percentage of growth, but it also becomes understandable if they're not meeting the growth that we would expect of everybody else in the school district to do that. And the next comment is if we're talking about the school report card, did anybody reach out to the Department of Public Instruction to have a representative here to talk about the report card?
Let's see if this works. I don't know if Alan's able to hear me. Awesome.
Alan, can you hear not if you can hear Colleston?
Can you hear me now, Alan?
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, great. All right. Saved you some walking today. Let's see if I can tackle these a bit in order, and I'll try to cluster a couple of them. You asked about students, English learner students. Yes, we did look at that. I didn't include it just because we were already running out of space on the graphs, but we did look at that, and we did note the same trends. You have a significant proportion of students who identify as English learners here in Rock County. We do in the city of Milwaukee as well. We did some deeper analysis for City of Milwaukee schools, and the same story that we told holds true for those English learner students. You asked about students who are engaged in special education programs, and certainly, one we should acknowledge are most significant. They're students with the most significant learning disabilities. They either take an alternate assessment, dynamic learning maps, not included in any of this analysis here. But for the majority of students, federal law, Wisconsin state law, longstanding expectation, nothing changed in terms of which students are required to be assessed with the set of changes from last year to this year. Yes, students who are enrolled in special education classes are there for a reason, and at least our take would be that those students can still learn and should still be expected to learn and should still be supported in their learning. I think it's sort of a elevated case of the basic challenge that Alan was putting in front of us. The numbers are telling us a story that these students are not doing well, and so the question becomes, what are we going to do to ensure that those students are served well? And finally, you asked, I can't speak for today's panel, I can speak more generally. We have certainly had contact or attempted to have contact with the department, to understand the rationale for the changes, the process by which the changes were made. I've tried to give where we have it from publicly available sources, either what the superintendent or members of her team have shared as their reasons. I know that they have been public in other forums as well on that, so I don't want to speak for them. But I would say that there have been places, in particular on this question of the lowering of standards, where a 22 to a 19, it's hard not to describe that as a lowering. I don't think that's a subjective assessment, right? The number went down. Yet, amongst other things, there have been claims at multiple points in time that we are not lowering standards, and it's hard to reconcile that with the reality of, the cut score was 22 on the ACT, the cut score is now 19 on the ACT.
Okay, another question?
I'm sorry, I'm a retired school teacher from this district. And I've been on about 7 years, so some of this is really hitting me in the face, and I'm having a really hard time with it. First of all, I don't understand why the rigor was lowered. I just don't understand it. And I guess why I don't understand it is because I was always taught from the time I started teaching that all students can learn. and that your job as an educator is to make sure that they are in a safe environment, that they're happy in their environment, so that they can learn. So it bothers me a great deal that the rigor has been dropped. And whether you put a 22 on it or a 19, we have to find a way so that all students are learning, whether it's in this district or anywhere else. And in the city of Beloit, we're down 30 teachers, and I work with the second grade class in the district, and I see her work every single day and how hard she's working to make sure that every student is learning and every student is ready for that test. What I question is are the teachers today given an opportunity to look at the assessments that they're going to be, the students are going to be assessed on? Are they given the opportunity to also look at the kinds of questions that they're going to be, the students are going to be answering? Because those are, it's really important for teachers to know what kinds of questions they're going to be asked, so that in the classroom, they're also asking those kinds of questions. And I remember when I was in the district, we spent a lot of time with teachers doing that. And I think it's important that kids get those kinds of questions, the really high-level critical questions. So there's a lot of things going on, but I don't understand why the rigor is gone. I don't understand that, because we are not doing our students any justice by lowering that rigor. We just aren't. And I don't understand also why Common Core is not being used either, because a lot of time was spent on developing teachers using Common Core and meeting the standards.
Great, thanks, and we'll have, Colleston can answer Alan if you want, but I love that we said in this district or any other, because this is brand new. This is coming down from the state right now, and there's probably many rooms around the state that are having these same conversations. So 1 foot in Beloit, but also 1 foot at the state level trying to figure this out. Colleston?
Yeah, in response to your rare comment, I would just say, yes, we fully agree with the concern you're expressing. In response to the question about testing items, the short answer is yes, so those are still available because this is the first year with a revised forward exam. Usually those items are release test items, so I know they've seen items under the old system, and I don't know if they've seen some of the new questions. The other thing that I would note and would give credit, at least partial credit, the standard setting process, the process by which the new benchmarks were set, did involve a group of, I think it was 88 or so educators from around the state representing different types of schools and different grade levels. What's frustrating to us in part is that we don't have any insight into that process. Those participating educators are literally subject to non-disclosure agreements, so they're not able to speak about the process. And what's been presented thus far from state officials doesn't really speak to, beyond noting that educators participated in the standard setting process, doesn't speak to what recommendations they made, what guidance they were given, so it's a bit of a black box to understand it. So we know they had voice, we just don't know were they listened to, weren't they listened to, what were their recommendations.
Alan?
I mean, has the rigor been lowered? I would say yes. The DPI folks would say it's an appropriate lowering, but that this is a more realistic and fair assessment of what you're looking for in students. But if you have to hit the ball 400 feet to get a home run, or you have to hit the ball 325 feet to get a home run, more kids are going to hit a home run at the 325-foot wall, and that's what's going on at the moment. That doesn't mean student performance has improved because the home run percentage is up. It definitely hasn't changed, I think. And the good news out of what is a mess here, because you really can't compare this year's scores to prior years, and for a bunch of reasons, is that you can see that the picture is still the same. I see why I'm not in Beloit. The gaps between higher income kids and lower income kids and so on are really pretty severe by these measures, as the presentation of Colleston showed. It actually increased. And on the other hand, they're not really great and entirely satisfactory anywhere in the state, even in the highest income district. So the big picture is still there. And it's any sense of comparison that isn't easy anymore. In fact, it's almost impossible. And yes, the rigor level, the rigor goals have been lowered. EPI would say this is appropriate and fair and responsive to what educators around the state have been telling them. Everybody gets to make up their own mind on that.
So I wanted to speak to using the ACT test in 11th grade as a measure of college readiness. By definition, 11th graders aren't college ready. They still have 30% of their high school career left to complete, and so using an assessment of early spring 11th graders, to me, seems very problematic. And then to say, oh, they got a 19, they're going to be misled when they are going to apply to college. That application process isn't going to happen for another 6 months at least. And so I'm curious as to why the school district, and this isn't exactly the conversation we're having today, but why the state uses ACTs as a measure. The pre-ACT in 10th grade makes sense. That test is modified to sort of suggest what kind of a score you might get upon completing high school. But in 11th grade, it's the actual ACT itself. So if you take that class, and if you take that test at Beloit Memorial, which is paid for by the school, they carve out a time of the day so all kids have access to that test. The score that you get halfway through 11th grade becomes the score that's supposed to say, oh, you're ready for college in a year and a half later. If you want to improve on that score, then it's up to you or your parents to come up with another $100, transportation to another test site on a Saturday morning that may or may not be work for your schedule. So to me, I don't understand why the state uses that as the assessment, not a modified version in 11th grade, because by definition you're not ready for college yet, but also then to use those numbers as sort of a way to sound like, oh my God, kids aren't going to succeed because this number isn't high enough. So I just wanted to point that out. The other point too to that college readiness piece, I just looked up the statistic. 80% of universities and colleges out there these days are test optional, so you don't even need to submit that test. Half the schools that my son is applying to right now don't require any test score for them to make a judgment about your application for no.
Any comment on that?
As
I
to,
think there's quite a bit of history,
Go
going
ahead.
back, let's say 30 years, as to what Wisconsin's used in the way of tests. That's one of the reasons it's been hard to do comparison. So there have been different, especially at the high school level, different tests over the years. And going back to that history from 2010 to 12 or so, when there were supposed to be 2 large consortiums nationwide that were going to kind of level the field and make it more consistent. And that totally broke down, largely for political reasons. Then there was the Badger test, the forward test, and the backward test. I don't know what. I think the ACT may well be there just because it's nationally consistent and readily available. There's a practical and financial aspect to some of these choices when you're running the state of Wisconsin. So that may be the answer, because it's the most practical version. And I think there would be people who would say it is still a valid test of 11th graders. Many 11th graders take it, whether or not it's being used for state accountability. But there's been so many changes over the years.
the effect of truant students, or students who are not coming to school, on the students who do come, and on their teachers. I say this because in Beloit we have a dramatic problem of students who don't come to school. Again, effect on the students who do come, effect on the teachers.
That issue of truancy or chronic absenteeism that it's sometimes labeled is absolutely a challenge. It's a challenge across the state. It's a challenge nationally. It's a challenge that's become far more acute in the wake of the pandemic and learning disruptions, and students were in and out of classrooms for various reasons for a number of years. It's gotten a lot of national attention, and we've certainly seen those trends rising in Wisconsin. We see a lot of that data here in Wisconsin when we get the state report cards. Absentee or attendance rates and absenteeism is one of the sort of bigger missing pieces of the overall school performance picture that we don't get with the state assessment results that we will get in the next couple of weeks when we get the full report card results. We have some indications that we've maybe sort of hit the peak of chronic absenteeism, that we're starting to see those numbers come down, but they're coming down from a significantly elevated level, and they still remain significantly elevated compared to where we were beforehand. So that is to say, I would still categorize it as a real crisis and something that demands our collective attention in terms of how do we get students in school consistently every day, where they're learning, where they're engaged. I don't know that or frankly, I don't know that very many people nationally have the answers to that. We have seen some promising work where communities have tracked data and sort of worked across multiple different strategies to try to put a dent into this. We've seen individual schools that have been able to bring those rates down pretty dramatically through home visits and social worker, counselor outreach, and those sorts of things. But I think we are still nationally across the state, grappling with how do we ensure that students are in school every day consistently enough to be learning, to not create disruptions for their peers, and ensure that their learning is going on. So absolutely, it's something that needs further attention.
Hi, I'm concerned about the lowering of standards, but what you were saying about the report cards, when they're not using the same criteria to judge all of the schools in the same way, what is the point of the report card? And my other concern with the report card is the issue that Tom just brought up, is the chronic absenteeism, because that data is a year delayed. So you're talking about chronic absenteeism for a year that does not match the assessment data that you're talking about. And I really don't understand why the state is so delayed at that chronic absenteeism rate. The rate for last year won't be available publicly until April. That makes no sense to me. But again, I wonder why we bother with the report card at all, because it doesn't, you said that school got 4 stars and this school got 2 stars, but you're using different criteria to determine the number of stars. That makes no sense.
So, 2 points. One, I'd say fully agree, and we can't. There's only so many things we can tackle in one presentation, but fully agree, and have expressed concerns, and opinions will vary. Lots of people have their. I'm not going to attempt to speak for why we have the system we have now, but except to say it does make it difficult to understand how schools are doing one compared to the other, and I think there are good reasons that we don't want a system that is just based on proficiency. I do think, the economic circumstances of families matter, and, at least our position is that every child and every student is able to learn, every school can educate all students, and so we should hold them accountable for that. And that's been a, difficult conversation, and policy decisions have been made in some cases at DPI, in some cases around the report card. Some of these actually started legislatively or are rooted in legislation. So unlike with these cut score changes, much of the conversation about the report card starts with DPI, but there are other actors in the legislature, and there are some state laws that govern some portion of this as well. You raised another issue in the context of chronic absenteeism, and I fully agree for anyone brought in it. All of this data comes out incredibly late for us to be able to use. It's October, we're a third of the way through the next school year. We won't see report cards until almost Thanksgiving for the last school year. And while schools get this information a little bit earlier, even they are, maybe if they're lucky, getting it just before the first day of school. Not in enough time to actually make informed decisions about how they're instructing students or shifts that they need to make. And then by the time it gets out to those of us who are parents, other members of the public, does it matter? Is it important? I would say I'd still argue yes, but is it dated, and are we, is it limiting in terms of our ability to make informed decisions in the here and now about what we need to shift or change now? Absolutely yes. And are there other states that do this better? Yes. Ohio is one that just comes to mind, top of mind for me. They recently passed legislation. Their version of our assessment results have to be released to families, I believe, by July 1st every year, and their version of their state report cards have to be released by mid-August. That gives more time for families, members of the public, everyone to understand, how students were doing, and actually make decisions going into the next school year, as opposed to being a third of the way through the school year before that information is available. So, we kind of focused in on the changes that happened this year, but the timing of these releases is absolutely a challenge.
And just to add one piece sort of in defense of report cards, in my view, they're really important in the state because it's the only, metric or measure that we have that is comparable across all grades, across all schools. We have it for traditional public schools, we have it for charter schools, we have it for private schools participating in voucher programs. And while I agree with you, the star rating itself, you can't really compare a school with 100% economically disadvantaged students with a school with 0 because of the variable weighting. The individual component scores, the achievement score since 2015 has been stable, and that compiles test scores for students across all grades. And that kind of information is really hard to get. If you just go on DPI's website, I challenge you to try to find that information. The report card is the one aggregation of all of that for all schools. And in that, I think it's really valuable. And another reason why these changes and the disruption it's going to cause over the next couple of years is so frustrating to me.
All right, I've got a question here and then up front. Raise your hand if you want me to head over there. I see another one over there. Alan, I'm just going to let you raise your hand and come in when you need to, rather than call on you and make you respond. So here's a question.
This question is for Alan. Good morning, Alan. My name is Jim Bender. I've worked on education around Milwaukee and the state for quite a while. I have a lengthy answer to your question about the report card. I was kind of the one that put that disaggregate.
Jim, I almost handed the mic to you.
I know. The simple answer, and I'll just take 1 second. The simple answer is the first version of the report card that came down. If you laid the report card map over the demographic map of Wisconsin, it was the same map. Meaning when you just record proficiency score, it only tells you what the demographics of your school are. It has no implication of what the impact of your school is on your student body, which is why the change was made. But to Colleston's point, maybe we should change it in the future. My question, however, is trying to take advantage of Alan's reading on COVID medicine. And I'd like to get a very clear answer here. He made reference to the current governor putting the standards up. Before the governor made that change, 83% of students in Wisconsin were considered proficient in reading. After they NAEPized them, they got reduced down to 39. And the now governor, the superintendent at the time, took quite a beating publicly because of that. And he has made some comments very recently about these cut scores getting changed, which were not positive, which is a bit of an oddity in Wisconsin, where you've got kind of a political alignment that is talking negatively about other aspects of education. So Alan, in your current state of COVID, I'm asking you to see what your opinion is on the governor and Underly not necessarily being in the same place on these cut scores.
Well, that's certainly interesting. I don't think the governor was super forward or assertive on that, but he did say thought it was a good idea going back to his action in 2012. I mean, some of you, the only way to win this is by looking at both, looking at an objective, a strong standard, and looking at the realities. As you said, the prior versions of the state report here, the early versions, were really just a way of measuring demographics and socioeconomics. So you say, how's the school doing? You know, there's schools in Milwaukee, there's schools in Beloit that are doing well, much better than the average for those cities and for dealing with the needs of the population of students they have. And they deserve some credit for that. But their actual test scores are still well below what you find in a high-income community in some of the Milwaukee suburbs, for example. So that was the motivation to start measuring student progress. And on the other hand, to only measure student progress would penalize some of those high-performing districts where students progress 1 year for every year, and that's really good, except if you're looking for them to progress 1.5 years for every year, they would be actually penalized for doing a good job. So it's an attempt to balance it all out. Maybe the current system went too far. I mean, you've got schools, a year ago when the report cards came out, you got schools in Milwaukee that were getting 3 stars or 4 stars that had 5 or 7 or 10% of their students at the professional level. You say, that doesn't seem right to me. What's going to happen politically between the governor, the DPI, the election coming, dare I say, for state superintendent, right behind the national elections next week, and the back channels on that are already underway, including this very eye-catching situation, which I admit I don't understand, of a candidate announcing he's being backed by WEAC to run against Jill Underly, who the Democratic Party spent something like $2+ million on her campaign 4 years ago. So this is going to be very interesting. And the makeup of the legislature, which is likely to be considerably different going into the new term in January. I know there are Republicans, I've talked to some, who want to rein in the powers of the state superintendent to make decisions such as changing the report cards and the state testing system. I know I will shock all of you by pointing out that there's a lot of politics in education. This is where politics shows up.
Okay, it's obvious that these changes are going to have serious effects on kids, whether you're one of the higher achieving ones or one of the lowest. You're going to, you're at a lower standard now. Parents are going to be more comfortable with what they see on these report cards, and so will our schools. So my concern really, you said it twice, and it's really unbelievable to me that they were able to have these meetings and make these changes behind closed doors. And then you said even a certificate of non-disclosure.
Right.
That's unbelievable, because we live in a state with open meetings laws, and our own superintendent would not be able to have a meeting about which math curriculum to choose without making that open to the public. How can the superintendent of schools for the entire state make changes like this that are definitely going to affect our kids without public even being able to see what's being said and done behind these closed doors? Has anyone challenged this, or do you think we could?
So, all good points that I'll be step back and sort of reemphasize something Alan said. The structure by which we govern statewide public education decisions in Wisconsin is one of one. The fact that we have the combination of an elected state superintendent, no elected state school board or other sort of supervisory body, there's no relation, politically there might be alliances, but there's no, so legally they're distinct constitutional officers, and the state superintendent doesn't report in the same way that other, department heads and state government would report to be appointed by and report through the governor. So this essentially becomes an internal decision within the Department of Public Instruction, in this case, from start to finish. It means that the way, I would say on the one hand, it means that the way that we have accountability and scrutiny over these decisions is through our participation in the electoral process. All of us are being bombarded by all the ads and the attention that's being paid to the presidential race. The state superintendent race is on the ballot, but it's on the ballot in February and April of next year. At a time when, if you're like me, you're a little bit tired of it all by the time we get to November. We know that far fewer people turn out in those races. They've been, historically, they've been much lower turnout, lower profile affairs. You get sort of a committed base that shows up on one side, and we may have 3.5 million people vote in the presidential election. I think in some cases it's fewer than 1 million that are voting for state superintendent of public instruction. Yet these incredibly consequential decisions can be made there. I know that there have been efforts, and I should give a hat tip. I thought I saw somebody here somewhere. There have been some organizations that have done public records requests and brought some of this information to light. But we are concerned by how much of this process was conducted behind closed doors. I understand that when you're looking at individual student test scores, you need to do that, in a way that is, respectful of those students and compliant with FERPA and compliant with state laws. I'm not suggesting that everything should be done out in public. It would be good to be hearing from the educators who were in the room. It'd be nice for that room. I think educators are an important voice, but I've got a 10 and a 7-year-old, and separate from my hat as an advocate or an educator, as a parent, I've got some perspectives on these things too. I wonder how were those voices included in this conversation? Were they? Which other voices were or weren't included? We talked earlier about higher ed. Who was present at what point from that type of environment in these conversations? It just seems to me that when these decisions are made inside of the department, it becomes easy to focus on the sort of close-in stakeholders to the department, to the exclusion of lots of other groups that have real vested interest in the outcomes of the decisions that are being made. Which is, said another way, it just seems like not everyone who needed to be in the conversation was in the conversation, and it's unclear, besides our ability to put somebody different into the office of state superintendent, what can be done short of that to bring these processes together, but it's really ultimately at the state superintendent's decision, just because of the structure of how things are set up here in Wisconsin.
Dennis?
I think one consideration innate that a lot of people don't talk about is how well Wisconsin performs on 4th and 8th grade math compared to the nation. We're performing near the top of the nation in those areas of math, but then when we try to translate that into state test scores, we're saying that we're failing all over the state. And you're comparing a national test then and bringing it down to a state test, and a state that performs very well against the nation. So where you don't see that quite as well, but outperforming the nation, is reading. And when you ask what are we doing about that, that's where the science of reading and the Act 20 piece certainly come in, and we can all say we want immediate responses to that. That's not gonna happen overnight. They could release the funds, that would be a nice start legislatively to get things going. But I think that's where some of the push comes on why the NAEP is where it's at, and then when you try to translate that into state testing throughout the state, you're gonna see a high performing state. So when you translate that down into state test scores, then you start to look, you're comparing districts against the state average. That's what the entire report card is, okay? And in terms of why we have the differential in the first two categories, there's a lot of districts that don't like it, that were always high performing districts anyway. And if you're in Whitefish Bay, which is right next to Milwaukee, and your free and reduced lunch population is 1.8%. Milwaukee's is 83.4%. I don't think we're comparing the same things. That's the reason for the difference on the report card. And in general, the report cards are garbage, like they are, okay? They are very, they don't have very much use for a school district with data that's 3 years old. And what we need to be more responsive to on the report cards, and what some of us as educators would like to see, is bring some of the career and college readiness indicators into the report cards if you're asking what can be done with them. Because there's a lot of success stories in schools, whether it's AP test rates, pass rates, dual credit college courses. There's a lot of factors where you're gonna see industry credentials, where you're gonna see schools having a lot of success but we don't wanna measure those things, and we haven't measured them yet. What I'm hearing from DPI is that's the direction they wanna go, and I, for one, would support that and the change in the report.
If I can jump in, you know, when I talked to DPI folks a number of weeks ago, they said, it appeared to me that they really wanted to downplay the state test scores as far as what parents and teachers ought to be thinking. They said people ought to be more tuned, parents particularly, to the range of data they can get from their child's school or teachers, whether it's the school's more routine, more frequent tests like the MAP test, or simply report cards and grade points, or teacher-parent conferences, whatever, that you should focus on what you're hearing from the school because it has more depth, it's more current, it's got data more over time, and I'm all in favor of that. That's certainly what we did when our kids were school age. You know, is really try to stay in touch with the school. The question is, what about getting the big picture? And that's becoming harder and more complicated. 20-some years ago, I went to a national state testing czars convention in the Snowbird Ski Resort outside Salt Lake City. I don't get junkets like that very often. I thought it was great. But in any case, there was a panel discussion in which there were like 5 participants, and from academic, school district, whatever. The first 4 of them were all educators who said standardized tests are useless, they're invalid, they are overemphasized, no one should pay attention to them. The 5th speaker was at that time, education advisor to the governor of Indiana, and he said, I don't care what any of you say, my boss wants test scores. And needless to say, he's the one who prevailed in the debate. Howard Gardner, the person who coined the whole concept of multiple intelligences and such, very much not a testing type person. I once had a conversation with him when he was in Milwaukee, and he said, on my side, we have failed to come up with a good system, a usable system for judging overall performance of schools and students that can work for public accountability. And that's why we still are stuck with state testing. It is the national law. Since No Child Left Behind passed in 2001 and 2002, and even with the renewal in 2015 of what's now called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, one of the most cynical names in politics, but it has nothing to do with students succeeding. And the one principle that remained in that law when it was renewed is national testing, because in large part, nobody's come up with a better system. So if you're talking about your kid, pay attention to your school. If you're talking about kids in the big picture, it's not going very well.
Great, we got one more question, thank you.
Thank you. I've appreciated some of the memory lane, Mr. Borzak, because I was in Milwaukee Public Schools for 18 years, and I actually was in the school that rolled out the standards. We were a demonstration school that year that the City of Milwaukee was engaged in. He actually came and visited our school and had an interview. And so when we talk about the landscape of testing, and at times, as I appreciate what you just said in regards to Howard Gardner, and you'll know this more than the people in the room, I'm also a Marquette grad and was under the schooling of Dr. Lowe. And so I know you're familiar with him, Mr. Borzak, as we saw each other at his retirement party.
A really good guy.
Absolutely, and I know that if you read his scholarship, what he says and where he lands in the overemphasis of testing to students and what it's done, especially to our kids in high poverty areas. But what I want to address is what you said earlier, is that in, I believe that was 2012, when we rolled over to state standards, and we had a new assessment. At that time, it was actually Smarter Balance, and then to your point earlier, it was a political move to move that test out, and then we came up with the forward. The cut scores changed overnight. So where we had a reflection of, on the state level, 80% of the students meeting proficiencies, it dropped drastically overnight. So suddenly we had a new narrative around how well students were doing and to what extent they were achieving. Fast forward, I appreciate the comment that we had about NAEP, or comments in regards to NAEP, because as reflective practitioners should be in education, even more interesting, we're at this transition of Early and Governor Evers. If you have NAEP and our state is testing in high ranks, top 10, why is our state cut scores revealing less than half the state is proficient? There's a gap there. And so we went from 80% or whatever it was, high levels of students achieving, new adoption of state standards, new assessments, dropped overnight significantly. We've been in this system for 10 years or more, and now we're reflecting, if we continue to be in the top quartile of NAEP, perhaps our cut scores need to be adjusted. And as we reflect on that, and I am familiar with schools that can in City Ford, I have several friends that were part of that leadership cohort in schools that can. And so I appreciate that, the beginnings of that work. But I do think it would behoove us to continue to be reflective as we think about proficiency scores in alignment to assessment. I also think when we consider the word standards, that word has multiple meanings. In my world of curriculum instruction, I'm talking about state standards. We don't do the Common Core anymore because, yes, that was a political football that the state of Wisconsin had to adopt state standards. In this change, we're not changing the standards of what students need to know. We're changing the measurement in how we measure. And that is something that I think is worth reflecting on as we go forward. And the last point, I just wanted to let some folks know in the room, we had actually teachers that were called upon by the state in the city of Beloit to participate in those conversations. And although we may want to know more about the process, I was really glad that we had teachers that are in our schools working with our kids, representing us at that state level conversation about what's appropriate for our kids and what isn't.
Thanks. Yeah, so Colleston, you can answer. We're at our time, but answer the way you need to. So I just wanted to quick thank everybody. This seems like exactly the kind of conversation, exactly the kind of tone, the questions, the perspective, the height for something that is so recently happening. Everyone's trying to wrap their hands around.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'll briefly answer and then echo thanks as well. I know we're trying to wrap here. Just a couple of points that have been raised at different points in time about where Wisconsin is in comparison to national performance, either on math or overall. This is one reason that we do think the ACT is helpful, because that does give us more national reach. And I know there are, those of us who are educators know there's lots of conversations about where one falls on whether or not NAEP sets an appropriate proficiency standard or not, and how that compares to state proficiency standards. That's probably way too much for us to tackle right now. The point that I do want to draw out here, though, around the importance of assessments and why, while imperfect, I would at least argue that there's something we should be looking at, is maybe an extension of a point that Spencer made earlier. When the Every Student Succeeds Act, the most recent reauthorization, went forward, some of the loudest groups in support of maintaining assessment structures were national civil rights organizations. And the reason why they have historically been strong supporters of this is that prior to, universal state, assessments that were, required under No Child Left Behind and then every subsequent reauthorization, it was very hard to understand how different subgroups of students were performing nationally or in particular states. It's an issue we especially struggle with here in Wisconsin. We have some of the widest opportunity or achievement gaps between groups of students of any state in the country. that gets lost in the conversation when we just talk about averages. And I think that's, you know, an incredibly relevant factor. Of course, we do our work in Milwaukee. It's incredibly relevant for us there. It's relevant, and I think we had an earlier conversation, questions about students with disabilities, English language learners. It's a relevant conversation across our state. Many, you know, we've talked about some of the higher ed programs that have walked away from ACT or gone test optional during the pandemic. Many of those schools are reversing those decisions because they too found that when they lost sight of these things, they were seeing a widening in terms of access gaps and who was making entry into their schools. And so they've actually, you know, some of those schools have started to reverse those decisions and return to requiring some form of assessment because it gave them a better, more complete picture. So I know that it's not, you know, one test is one test. It's not everything, but it does give us something. And so I hope that in the conversation on all sides, we can find space to both acknowledge the utility of this measure and acknowledge that there's a lot more going on than any single set of measures or state report card or state assessments that we're going to capture. And both of these things can be true at the same time. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be here today, so thank you all for having us.
Thank you, Colleston. Spencer as well. Alan, thank you. We'll have you come back when you're feeling better as we continue this conversation as we go. Everybody grab a flyer on the way out. This is one of our civic affairs in our civic affairs series. And so take the flyer, and these are the kind of conversations that we need and want to happen. So thanks very much.